Germany, 1958. The world's biggest rock and roll star had just been drafted into the United States Army. Elvis Presley, the king of music, the voice that made millions scream, was now just another soldier. No special treatment, no stage lights, no screaming fans, just a uniform, a rank, and orders to follow. But what happened when a high-ranking general decided to test him, to mock him in front of his fellow soldiers, became one of the most brilliant moments of Elvis's life. This is the story of how Elvis Presley turned humiliation into respect, and why his reaction still teaches us something powerful today. If you're ready to witness one of the most underrated moments in Elvis's career, make sure you're subscribed to The Hidden Legacy. Hit that like button and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't get told enough. Let's dive in. Elvis Aaron Presley didn't want to go to war. He had everything to lose. At 23 years old, he was at the peak of his career. His music was dominating the charts. His movies were breaking records. His name alone could sell out any venue in the world. But in December 1957, he received his draft notice. The United States Army didn't care who you were. Fame didn't grant you exemption. Wealth didn't buy you a pass. And Elvis knew that avoiding service would destroy his image forever. So he made a choice. He would serve, not as a celebrity, not with special privileges, but as a regular soldier, just like everyone else. On March 24th, 1958, Elvis Presley walked into the induction center in Memphis, Tennessee. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The world watched as the king of rock and roll became Private Presley. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had advised him to serve with dignity, to show America that Elvis wasn't just a rebellious entertainer, but a patriotic young man willing to do his duty. And that's exactly what Elvis intended to do. Basic training was brutal. Elvis was stationed at Fort Hood in Texas, where he endured the same grueling physical conditioning as every other recruit. He woke up at dawn. He marched in formation. He cleaned latrines. He took orders from men who didn't care about his fame. Some of his fellow soldiers resented him at first. They assumed he'd get special treatment, that his celebrity status would shield him from the hardships they all faced. But Elvis proved them wrong. He worked harder than most. He never complained. He never asked for favors. And slowly, he earned their respect. But Fort Hood was just the beginning. After completing basic training, Elvis received new orders. He was being deployed to Germany, assigned to the 3rd Armored Division in Friedberg, just outside Frankfurt. This was it. He was leaving American soil, heading into a foreign country, far from the stages and studios that had made him a legend. And Germany in 1958 was still a nation recovering from the aftermath of World War II. It was a place where American soldiers were both welcomed and scrutinized, where the presence of the U.S. military was a reminder of a war that had ended just 13 years earlier. Elvis arrived in Germany in October 1958. The media was waiting for him. German reporters, American journalists, military photographers, they all wanted a piece of the story. Elvis Presley, the rock and roll icon, was now a soldier in a foreign land. But Elvis didn't play into the spectacle. He kept his head down. He did his job. He drove trucks, operated machinery, and followed orders without hesitation. His fellow soldiers began to see him not as a celebrity, but as one of them. And that's when things got interesting. There was a general stationed in Germany. His name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately forgotten, but his actions were not. He was a decorated officer, a man who had served in World War II, a commander who demanded absolute discipline and respect. And he didn't like Elvis, not because of anything Elvis had done, but because of what he represented. To this general, Elvis was a symbol of everything wrong with the younger generation. Rock and roll was corrupting America's youth. It was loud, rebellious, and vulgar. And here was its king, wearing the same uniform as the men who had fought real wars, men who had bled for their country. The general saw Elvis as a joke, and he made no effort to hide it. One afternoon, during a routine formation, the general decided to make an example of Elvis. The soldiers were standing at attention, lined up in perfect rows, waiting for inspection. The general walked slowly down the line, his eyes scanning each man, his boots clicking against the pavement. When he reached Elvis, he stopped. He looked him up and down, his expression cold and dismissive, and then he spoke. "So you're the famous Elvis Presley," the general said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The rock and roll singer who thinks he's a soldier." The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They knew what was happening. This was a test, a deliberate attempt to provoke Elvis, to see if he would break, if he would react with anger or defiance. The general continued. "Tell me, Presley, do you think your little songs are going to help you here? Do you think your fans are going to save you when things get tough?" Elvis stood perfectly still. His face showed no emotion. His eyes remained forward, locked on the horizon. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, at attention, exactly as he was supposed to. The general waited, clearly expecting a reaction, but Elvis gave him nothing. The general leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still carried across the formation. "You're not special here, Presley. You're just another private, and if you can't handle that, maybe you should have stayed home with your guitar." Still, Elvis said nothing. His jaw remained set. His posture remained rigid. He was a soldier, and soldiers didn't talk back to superior officers. The general, frustrated by the lack of response, straightened up and moved on down the line. But the damage was done. The insult had been delivered in front of dozens of men. The humiliation was public, and everyone was watching to see what Elvis would do next. What Elvis did next was nothing, at least not in that moment. He finished the formation. He returned to his duties. He didn't complain to his friends. He didn't seek sympathy. He didn't storm off to make a phone call to his manager or demand a transfer. He simply continued being a soldier, but those who knew Elvis understood that he wasn't ignoring what had happened. He was thinking, he was planning, and when Elvis Presley planned something, it was always brilliant. Over the following weeks, Elvis worked harder than ever. He volunteered for extra duties. He helped other soldiers with their tasks. He became known as someone you could count on, someone who showed up early and stayed late, someone who never complained, no matter how difficult the assignment. And the general noticed. He noticed that Elvis wasn't breaking. He noticed that the men respected him. And he noticed that his attempt to humiliate Elvis had backfired. But Elvis wasn't done. He knew that simply being a good soldier wasn't enough. He needed to do something that would not only prove his worth, but also shift the entire dynamic. And that's when he came up with his plan. If you're loving this story and want to see how Elvis turned this situation completely around, make sure you're subscribed to The Hidden Legacy. Smash that like button and hit the notification bell, because what happens next is absolutely legendary. There was a charity event being organized on the base. It was meant to raise money for German orphans, children who had lost their parents during the war and were still struggling in the aftermath. The event was important to the Army's public relations efforts in Germany, and several high-ranking officers, including the general who had mocked Elvis, were expected to attend. The base was looking for volunteers to help organize the event, and Elvis immediately stepped forward. He didn't just volunteer to help with logistics, he offered to perform for free. No publicity, no media circus. Just a simple performance to raise money for children who desperately needed it. The officers in charge were stunned. Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, was offering to perform on a military base in Germany for an audience of soldiers and orphans. It was unprecedented, and they immediately agreed. Word spread quickly across the base. Elvis was going to perform. Soldiers who had grown up listening to his music suddenly realized they were going to see him live. German civilians who lived near the base heard about it and requested permission to attend. Even the general, the same one who had mocked Elvis, heard about the performance, and he couldn't help but be curious. The night of the event arrived. A small stage had been set up in one of the base's recreation halls. Chairs were arranged in rows, and the room was packed. Soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder with German orphans, their faces filled with excitement. At the back of the room, standing with his arms crossed, was the general. He had come to see what all the fuss was about. Elvis walked onto the stage wearing his uniform, not a flashy jumpsuit, not a custom-made suit, just his standard army fatigues, the same ones he wore every day. The room erupted in applause. Soldiers cheered, orphans clapped, and Elvis smiled, not the rehearsed smile of a performer, but the genuine smile of someone who was exactly where he wanted to be. He picked up an acoustic guitar that had been provided for him. No backup band, no elaborate sound system, just Elvis, a guitar, and a room full of people who needed something to believe in. And then he started to play. He didn't perform his hits. He didn't sing Hound Dog or Jailhouse Rock. Instead, he played softer songs, ballads that spoke to the heart. He sang Love Me Tender, and the room fell silent. Soldiers who had been hardened by training found themselves moved by the simplicity of the performance. Orphans who had known nothing but loss felt for a moment something close to hope. And the general, standing at the back of the room, felt something shift inside him. Elvis performed for over an hour. He played songs that everyone knew, and he played songs that no one had heard before. He told stories between songs, stories about his own childhood, about growing up poor in Mississippi, about understanding what it meant to struggle. He connected with the audience not as a celebrity, but as a human being. And by the end of the performance, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When Elvis finished, the applause was thunderous. Soldiers jumped to their feet. Orphans rushed the stage to thank him. And Elvis knelt down to speak with every single child, shaking their hands, listening to their stories, making sure they knew they mattered. The event raised more money than anyone had anticipated, and the general, who had come to the event out of curiosity, left with a completely different perspective. The next morning, during formation, the general once again walked down the line of soldiers. When he reached Elvis, he stopped. The soldiers braced themselves, expecting another confrontation. But instead, the general extended his hand. Elvis, surprised, shook it. "Private Presley," the general said, his voice steady and sincere. "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew you, and I was wrong." Elvis nodded, his expression calm. "No apology necessary, sir. I'm just doing my duty." The general smiled, a rare expression on his usually stern face. "You did more than your duty last night. You reminded all of us why we're here. Thank you." And with that, the general moved on. But the impact of that moment rippled through the entire base. Elvis had done something remarkable. He hadn't responded to mockery with anger. He hadn't fought back with words. He had responded with action, with kindness, with a gesture so powerful that it changed the mind of a man who had been determined to dislike him. That was genius. Pure, undeniable genius. Elvis's time in Germany continued without incident. He served his full term, completing his duties with the same dedication he had shown from the beginning. He became known as one of the best soldiers in his unit, someone who could be trusted, someone who led by example. And when his service ended in 1960, he returned to the United States, not just as a rock and roll star, but as a man who had proven himself in a way few celebrities ever could. But the story of what happened in Germany, the story of the general who mocked him, and Elvis's brilliant response, remained largely unknown for decades. It wasn't a story Elvis told in interviews. It wasn't something his manager promoted. It was simply a moment that those who were there never forgot, and it taught a lesson that still resonates today. If you've made it this far, you're part of the Hidden Legacy family, and we don't want you to miss a single story. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on moments like this that shaped history in ways you never knew. Elvis Presley could have responded to that general with anger. He could have pulled rank through his fame, demanded an apology, or made a scene that would have been reported in newspapers around the world. But he didn't. He understood something that many people never learn, that true strength isn't about fighting back with force. It's about proving your worth through action. It's about letting your character speak louder than any insult ever could. The general had mocked him because he saw Elvis as nothing more than an entertainer, someone who didn't belong in a soldier's uniform. But Elvis didn't argue with him. He didn't try to convince him with words. He simply showed him through his work ethic, his kindness, and his willingness to serve others that he was wrong. And in doing so, Elvis didn't just earn the respect of one general. He earned the respect of every soldier on that base and every person who has heard this story since. This moment in Germany wasn't just about Elvis Presley proving himself to a skeptical officer. It was about the power of humility, the importance of service, and the brilliance of responding to negativity with positivity. Elvis could have been bitter about being drafted. He could have resented the time away from his career. He could have treated his service as an inconvenience, something to endure until he could get back to his real life. But he didn't. He embraced it. He gave it everything he had. And in doing so, he became more than just a musician. He became a symbol of what it means to serve with dignity. The charity performance for the German orphans wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't orchestrated by his manager to boost his image. It was Elvis's idea, born out of genuine compassion and a desire to make a difference. And that's what made it so powerful. The general had questioned whether Elvis's fame had any real value, whether his music meant anything in the context of military service. And Elvis answered that question not with a speech, but with a guitar, a voice, and a heart full of empathy. The orphans who attended that performance came from a generation scarred by war. Many of them had lost their parents in the bombings that devastated German cities. They had grown up in poverty, surrounded by the ruins of a broken nation. For them, the presence of American soldiers was a complicated reality, both a reminder of the war and a source of stability in its aftermath. And here was Elvis Presley, an American soldier who didn't see them as statistics or charity cases, but as children who deserved joy, dignity, and hope. When Elvis knelt down to speak with those children after his performance, he wasn't doing it for the cameras. There were no photographers capturing the moment for a magazine spread. He was doing it because he understood what it felt like to grow up with nothing. He had been poor himself. He had known hunger, uncertainty, and the ache of wanting a better life. And so, when he looked into the eyes of those German orphans, he saw himself, and he wanted to give them something he had been given, the belief that life could be better, that dreams were possible, that someone cared. The soldiers who witnessed that performance were changed by it. Many of them had been skeptical of Elvis when he first arrived. They had assumed he would be arrogant, that he would expect special treatment, that he would coast through his service on the strength of his fame. But watching him perform for those children, seeing the way he interacted with them, hearing the sincerity in his voice, it shattered every assumption they had. Elvis wasn't pretending to be humble. He was humble. He wasn't pretending to care. He cared. And that authenticity was impossible to fake. The general's apology the next morning was a turning point, not just for Elvis, but for everyone on that base. Apologies from high-ranking officers were rare. Admitting you were wrong in front of your subordinates was something that simply didn't happen in the rigid hierarchy of the military, but the general did it anyway, because Elvis's actions had forced him to confront his own prejudice, his own assumptions, his own mistakes. And that takes courage. It takes character. And it's a testament to the power of what Elvis had done. Elvis's reaction to the general's apology was equally telling. He didn't gloat. He didn't hold a grudge. He didn't use the moment to elevate himself at the general's expense. He simply accepted the apology with grace and moved on. Because for Elvis, it had never been about proving the general wrong. It had been about proving himself right about showing that he was exactly the kind of soldier he had set out to be. This story matters because it reveals a side of Elvis Presley that often gets overshadowed by the glitz and glamour of his fame. Yes, he was the king of rock and roll. Yes, he had the voice, the charisma, the stage presence that made him a legend, but he was also a man who understood the value of humility, the importance of service, and the power of kindness. And those qualities, more than any hit song or sold-out concert, are what made him truly great. Before we get to the final takeaway, make sure you're still with us. Subscribe to The Hidden Legacy, hit that like button, and turn on those notifications. The best stories are the ones that don't just entertain, they inspire. And this channel is built on that foundation. The lesson from Elvis's time in Germany extends far beyond the military. It's a lesson about how to handle criticism, how to respond to people who doubt you, and how to prove your worth without lowering yourself to pettiness or anger. Elvis didn't need to defend himself with words because his actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. And that's a skill that everyone can learn. In today's world, where social media amplifies every slight, every insult, every moment of conflict, it's easy to react with anger. It's easy to fire back with a harsh comment, to seek revenge, to try to tear down the person who tried to tear you down. But Elvis's story shows us a different way. It shows us that the most powerful response to negativity is not to fight fire with fire, but to rise above it entirely, to prove your critics wrong not by arguing with them, but by showing them who you really are through your actions. The general mocked Elvis because he didn't understand him. He saw a celebrity, a musician, someone who didn't fit his idea of what a soldier should be. But Elvis didn't waste time trying to change the general's mind through debate. He simply lived in a way that made it impossible for the general to maintain his prejudice. And when the general finally saw the truth, he had no choice but to admit he had been wrong. This approach requires patience, it requires confidence, and it requires a willingness to let your work speak for itself, even when it would be easier to speak for yourself. But the results are undeniable. Elvis didn't just earn the respect of one man, he earned the respect of everyone who witnessed what he did, and he left behind a legacy that still inspires people more than 60 years later. Elvis Presley's time in Germany was supposed to be a detour in his career, a 2-year interruption that would take him away from the spotlight. But it turned out to be one of the most defining periods of his life. It was the moment when he proved that he was more than just a performer. He was a leader, a servant, and a man of character. And that's why this story matters, because it reminds us that greatness isn't just about talent. It's about how you treat people, how you handle adversity, and how you choose to respond when the world tries to tear you down. The world remembers Elvis Presley for his music. They remember Heartbreak Hotel, Can't Help Falling in Love, and the electrifying performances that defined an era. But those who served with him in Germany remember something else. They remember a man who showed up, did his job, and made everyone around him better. They remember a man who didn't need fame to define him because his character already did. And they remember a moment when a general who had mocked him stood before him and admitted he had been wrong. That moment, that simple handshake and apology, is a testament to the power of integrity. It's proof that no matter how famous you are, no matter how much success you've achieved, the way you treat people will always matter more. Elvis understood that. He lived it. And because of that, his legacy extends far beyond the stage. So, the next time someone doubts you, the next time someone mocks you or tries to diminish what you're capable of, think of Elvis Presley in Germany. Think of the general who underestimated him, and think of the way Elvis responded. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with action, with kindness, with a performance for orphans, a willingness to serve, and a quiet confidence that eventually won over even his harshest critic. That's genius. That's strength. And that's a lesson we can all carry with us. No, matter where life takes us. Elvis didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to fight to prove his worth. He simply lived in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And in doing so, he reminded us all of what it truly means to be great. We've reached the end of this incredible story, but the journey doesn't stop here. The hidden legacy is built on uncovering moments like this, stories that shaped history and reveal the character behind the legends. If you found this story inspiring, if it reminded you of the power of humility and action, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, turn on notifications, and when the video ends, check out the other stories we've uncovered. Because history isn't just about the moments everyone remembers. It's about the moments like this one, the ones that reveal who people really were when no one was watching. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.